Go back. So far what we have said is this is the kind of design that we have for our neural network. Just to remind you, 784 input neurons, an input layer with 784 neurons, simply because my pictures are 28 by 28 and 784 is 28 square. Then there's a hidden layer which could be 15, 30, 20, and that's up to me. And there's an output layer with 10. So what we will do is we will try to use our neural network to recognize digits in a very standard repository called the MNIST dataset. MNIST stands for Modified National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is NIST is an US organization. They are the ones who came up with this dataset. The modified part is essentially the standardized. This was standardized to give for all pictures to become 28 by 28 grayscale and all that. And now you have a huge repository of handwritten digits, written essentially by primarily by two groups of people: US postal workers and school children. And so these were actual people writing these things down. And the MNIST data, the original MNIST data, essentially comes in two parts. 60,000 images, which are called training images. So this is the training set. These are the images which will be used to train our neural network. That is, for these 60,000 training images, we'll tell the computer, these are the images, these are the labels, and we'll try the computer to see, we'll try to see whether the computer can ultimately give you right results. Well, to check for that, you use 10,000 testing images. So these 70,000 images is what is the entire MNIST data set. 60,000 of them are training images. 10,000 other images are again digits 0 to 9, written down by entirely different people. So the one important quality check is the people who wrote down the training images, they are not the ones who wrote down the testing images. Again, both sets were written down by US postal workers and school children, but different sets of school children, different sets of postal workers. Well, in our system, what we will actually do is we'll break up the 60,000 training images into 50,000 and 10,000, and use 50,000 to train and 10,000 to do what is called validation. We will discuss that in detail a bit later. But that's so ultimately the whole game will be played with 70,000 images, and we will see out of this 10,000 testing images how many can the program actually recognize. So the images, as I said, are grayscale, 28 by 28. So each training input is essentially a 784 element, a bunch of 784 numbers, which we call a 784 element vector. So it's a vector in a 784 dimensional space, which may sound crazy, but it's simply 784 numbers. And the desired output is a vector y in 10 dimensions. Why 10 dimensions? Because there are 10 possible outputs: 0, 1, 2, 3, up to 9. So for example, this particular y of x, which has a 1 in the 6th position. Okay, the t here is just transpose, writing a column vector. All these are, suppose it can be thought of as column vectors. That's the way we usually write down vectors when we write them down on a piece of paper. But writing a column vector takes up a lot of vertical space. So I wrote it, and this is a row vector, and just say take the transpose. So this has 1 in the 6th position. That means this stands for 5. Why 5? Because remember, the 1 in the 0th position will stand for 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. The standard counting trick. So we have 6. Here we have 10 possible inputs: 1, 9 zeros, 0, 1, 8 zeros, and so on. So labels will be one of these 10. There are vectors in 10-dimensional space, but there are only 10 specific vectors in that 10D space. So how do we know whether our program is at all doing well? Well, our network will produce a final activation, final output. We are still going to call it activation A, despite the fact that we have moved away from biological neurons quite a bit, and the outputs are not just 0 and 1, but there's some number. And the final activation A will depend on the input X, which is not a single number, but those 784. It will also depend on the weights. These again, of course, are not single numbers. They are weights for every one of the edges in the picture, but a huge number of them. And every bias, one for every neuron. So the network output for X is A XWB. So this is what, so A is some number, some 10-dimensional vector, which should be close to, ideally, it should be close to whatever input label you have. So we define what is called a cost function, which essentially tells you how far away you are. So what you do, you take the 10-dimensional vector Y, which is the actual label, Y corresponding to X. For give every input X, remember, comes with a label Y of X, which is one of the 10 possible vectors. Either it's 0 or 1 or 2 or whatever. So this Y of X is a 10-dimensional vector. A difference between these two 10-dimensional vectors, you take their norm squared. Norm squared means basically you take every component, square them and add them up. That will give you how far away your Y of X is from the label. Actual label is from what you tried. This is something which is pretty fair in inputs. The cost function is calculated by finding out how much each input deviates for the prediction for each input, which is A, deviates from the label Y. Then you square up the deviation so that you don't cancel positive, negative deviations. And then you just average all of them out. That's the cost function. And what we need to do is choose W and B, which of course, remember, is not one parameter each. W, there are a huge number of W's, huge number of B's. You want to choose them to make C as small as possible. So that's the goal. If, of course, notice that if CWB could be made 0, which is of course the smallest possible value, then each of these would have to be 0, which would mean that for each and every input, your output exactly matches the label. That is, your learning is perfect. Then, of course, maybe too much to ask for, but what we are trying to do is we need to choose W and B so that I can make C as small as possible. So this is a minimization problem. Minimization is a part of what is called optimization in technical language. Of course, minimization, maximization, all of them are optimization. And I'm going to give you a lightning review of optimization here. Most of you would say, why is somebody talking about that? After all, you know how to minimize functions, right? At least anybody who has done high school calculus knows how to minimize functions. Well, the reason why I'm saying that is the techniques we learned in high school will not work. Of course, the techniques we learned in high school is you differentiate and put the first derivative equal to 0. Of course, you also look at the second derivative, sign, and find out whether it's really a minimum or a maximum or something else. Firstly, those techniques were for single variable. Here you have more than one. But you might think that you might want to just take partial derivatives, which essentially are like derivatives, except that you are changing only one of the variables at a time, and then play the same game. Mathematically speaking, that's correct. Unfortunately, there are way too many variables involved here. So even in our very simple one hidden layer network that we are going to use, we have got 784 input neurons, 15 middle neurons. That already gives us 784 times 15, that many weights. Just between the 0th and the 1th layer. Between the 1th and 12th, there are 150 more, 15 times 10. Then there are the biases, 25 of them, 15 for the middle layer, hidden layer, 10 for the output layer. Well, 25 is a small number. Much more important is there are nearly 800 times 15, nearly 12,000 weights even for this simple problem. which means if you were to try to write down the partial derivative in terms of every one of them and set that equal to 0, you'll have around 12,000 equations to satisfy simultaneously, which frankly is way too difficult a job to do. Even writing down those equations would be way too difficult. Solving them simultaneously would be, well, quite absurd as a proposition. So the approach that we can use, this is why the standard techniques will not work. One approach that we will use actually is called stochastic gradient descent. That's quite a mouthful. So let me try to explain what this means. First, let's forget about stochastic. Let's just talk about gradient descent. And for this, despite the fact that we said that after all, ordinary calculus will not work because we have too many variables, to understand this, we come back to a small number of variables. Let's just say 2. Suppose we have a function C of 2 variables v1 and v2 and I've graphed such a function here. You can all see that there is a minimum sitting here. And for 2 variables, it's sort of straightforward. You'd calculate del C del v1, del C del v2, you get 2 functions of v1, v2, you equate them both to 0 and so on. Of course, with more than one variable, the question about whether you have a maximum or a minimum or something entirely different is way more complicated, even with only 2 variables than with only 1 variable. But that is something which, if high school physics mathematics is cannot teach you that, at least college mathematics will definitely teach you how to handle that. But I'm going to ask you to imagine, despite this picture, that this really is not a function of 2 variables, but a function of say 12,000. Then solving such equations will simply not work. But what can work is something like this. After all, we want to get to the valley here, to the bottom point, right? So what the idea is, we start somewhere, wherever, at random, and then we try to reach the valley. It's sort of, imagine that this is a sort of topological landscape or cartological landscape, some mountain pass with a valley in between. You're starting somewhere, and say a ball is there and the ball is trying to roll down until it reaches the valley. So for this, what we need to know is, when I change v1 and v2, how much does the cost change? Cost, remember, is this C which we want to try to minimize. Now this is where calculus comes in a big way. The cost changes, of course, because v1 changes. So there's a delta C piece, the change in C, which is due to delta v1, and there's a piece due to delta v2. And these factors in front, the partial derivatives, of course, many of you know partial derivatives. This is just for the ones you don't. Del C del 1 essentially says how much fast does C change when you change v1 without changing v2. So del C del 1 times delta v1, you can think of that as a change in C because of the change in v1. And this piece is the change in C because of the change in v2. When you add them together, you get the net change in C. So this is the formula. Of course, if you have more variables, v1, v2, v3, vn, then you get del C del v1 delta v1 plus del C del v2 delta v2 plus dot 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 del C del vn delta vn. We will next do something which goes beyond high school maths, but which is one of the first things you learn, at least in a physics course or a mathematical phase course, which you can write this thing as a dot product of 2 different vectors. One vector is delta v1, delta v2, as one vector has components delta v1, delta v2. This just says how much we are moving. Remember, v1, v2 are the variables we have. Imagine these are xy coordinates. So when I changed v1 and v2, we were moving. So delta v1 comma delta v2 is just how much we are moving. The other vector has components del C del v1, del C del v2, which essentially tells you how fast is the function C changing. And that vector is familiar to everybody who has done college physics, at least. This is so-called gradient of the vector of the scalar C. And this quantity can be written down as what is called something called a dot product, which is just component by component product and addition. Where the gradient of C, denoted by the symbol nabla of C, is this vector del C del v1, del C del v2. Once again, remember the transpose is there simply because I'm writing this as a row vector. this really should look like column vector. So del C del V1 del C del V2 is the gradient. Delta V1 delta V2 are components of the displacement delta V vector. If you dot them together, then of course you end up with this expression. For those of you who have not seen the dot product of the gradient before, just think of this as a sort of shorthand for this. Just a way of writing this thing down. In short, splitting out the two important pieces. Delta V vector essentially talks about the way in which the parameters change, and this essentially says how fast does the function change when the parameters do change. Now, all of you know, at least those of you who have studied gradient knows this very well, or even anybody who has seen the dot product before would recognize the change in C will be the largest if delta V vector happens to be in the same direction as nabla C. So grad C and delta V vector, when they're parallel, you get the largest possible change simply because of something which everybody knows about the dot product is A dot B is length of A times length of B times cosine of the angle between them. If they're parallel, the cosine of the angle between them is the largest possible value, namely +1. So you have delta C dot delta V. Yes, is pointing. If delta V points right in the direction of grad C, you are going to increase C the fastest. So anybody who has seen a contour map would know grad C essentially points in the direction in which the height rises the fastest. So they are perpendicular to the contour lines. If you move along the contour lines, of course, the height doesn't change. Height here stands for the cost function. And when you move perpendicular to the contour lines, C changes the most rapidly. But our aim, of course, is to decrease C the most rapidly. So at least decrease C. So gradient descent essentially works this way. Instead of going up along the gradient, you actually go down in the opposite direction. So if grad V is opposite to grad C, which means at every step, what you do is you change delta V. The change delta V, which is this time here, is directed opposite to grad C, which is why you multiply grad C by a negative number and add that to V. So what you're doing is you start at a point, at that point you have some gradient del C del V1 del C del V2. You choose a multiple of that, but a negative multiple of that, so that you're going in the opposite direction. And this ensures that you bring C down the fastest. This eta essentially sort of tells you how far you're going to move. Small eta means, of course, you're going to move little. Large eta means you're going to move a lot. So you're now essentially rolling downhill against the local gradient. At every point, there's a gradient, and you're going against that. Now, this eta is a hyperparameter. It's a parameter you have to fix from the outside. In this, in the language of machine learning, it's called the learning rate. Of course, if eta is large, the V's adjust rapidly, change very much in every step. If eta is small, it changes small amount in every step. Okay. So this eta is a hyperparameter which has to be fixed. Now you might think that after all, we want to learn very rapidly, so why don't we take a very large value of eta? Of course, if we do that, the problem is you may very well overshoot and go completely miss the value and go completely to the other side. And then you might try coming back but overshoot again. Choosing too big an eta is a problem. Choosing too small an eta also is a problem, because then you're going to move very, very slowly. Again, this hyperparameter has to be chosen from the outside. In fact, this is the reason, one of the reasons why people use the validation set. Remember, we talked about the training set of 60,000 MNIST pictures being broken up into 50,000 actual training pictures and 10,000 validation pictures. The reason why the validation is used essentially is we might even want to adjust eta by seeing how well the system fares against the validation data. There are other reasons as well, but I'm just going through just snippets of what's done. Too small a value of eta, as I said, the motion is too small, too slow. Too large a value, and you may overshoot and oscillate. So choosing eta is again a matter of art. And one thing this analogy of a ball rolling down to the bottom of the valley is nice to think about, but you have to also be very careful about this. After all, if most physics students would immediately think of this as a potential, this surface to be a potential surface, and just imagine that a physical quantum system will try to go and sit at the bottom of the potential, which is why it's trying to reach the valley and so on. But then I must remind you that if you are really dealing with a potential surface, then is the acceleration of the particle, which is related to the potential, right? Because the gradient of the potential, which is the force in that case, is related to the acceleration, not to the velocity. And then you have things like, in real, of course, if you tried rolling a real ball on a kadhai, for example, which has a shape like the surface I showed, the ball, of course, will not go to the bottom and stay at rest. It will go up and down and oscillate. So we are actually not really mimicking actual physics here, but we are trying to sort of take a cue from that. There are techniques where you go beyond stochastic gradient descent, use the idea that you already have some momentum. So it's not just the gradient which decides where you are going to go, it's both the gradient and what momentum you already have and all that. But those and there are certain advantages to that, but of course also computational difficulties increase. So it's again a matter of well, compromise between computational ease and trying to get as close to the physics as possible. And after all, remember, this is not a physics problem. I don't really care whether my ball behaves like a physical particle or not. What I care about is goes to the bottom of the well. Okay, so in our neural network, the cost function C. So this was for our toy function C with two variables V1, V2. In our neural network, the cost function C depends on all the ways Wk and the biases BL, B1, B2, B3, and so on. The inputs X, that is the pictures themselves, which are 784 dimensional vectors, and the labels Yx, the actual correct labels, these are treated as given quantities. These are known. So gradient descent, if you just look at the formula, it's pretty straightforward. Wk at any given stage will change to Wk prime, which is Wk minus the learning parameter eta times the partial derivative of C with respect to Wk. So this looks pretty straightforward. Similarly, BL, the biases will change to new biases, which are the old biases minus the learning parameter times del C del BL. So all looks very straightforward and something which we can always apply, even though notice that the calculation that we should have done using high school calculus is del C del Wk equals 0 for all the k's, del C del BL equals 0 for all the else, and then we could have solved them simultaneously and ended up with a very complicated huge set of equations. Here things are much simpler. You're not equating anything to 0. You're just calculating the local values, asking and using them to move. That's it. But here is the problem. The cost C is an average over all the inputs that we have. And how many inputs do we have? Well, in the MNIST data, for example, even if we don't take all the 60,000 pictures to train, only 50,000 of them, I still have 50,000 inputs. Okay. So remember, the form of the cost function was that you found the cost for every input, essentially how far every input, Cx is the cost for one input, sorry, how far is the output Yx, actual output level Yx from the output provided by your network. This is for the input X, and then you add up over all the X and then you divide by n the number of inputs, which is the average here. So the cost is an average over all the inputs. So you have to calculate this quantity for all the 50,000 input pictures before you can get C. And for the gradient, the same thing goes. The gradient of the cost function C is an average of all the 50,000 grad CXs in this case. Or 50,000, of course, is for this case, but in general, you will deal with a large number of data, input data. And gradient descent, for this to work, you have to calculate the gradient for every one of the inputs and then average over all of them. So the training inputs, the number of training inputs is typically very huge. 50,000 for MNIST is actually a low one in the order. Most inputs are much higher than that, most typical inputs. So, yeah, this is the difficulty. You end up moving, for each step of movement, I need to actually find out all the 50,000 gradients and then average them and then decide how much to move. Now, this slows down gradient descent a lot, which is why gradient descent is not what is used. If you really use gradient descent, your point to make one move, well, it will move only when all the gradient CXs are calculated, then it's going to make one move. On the other hand, if you could sort of use a part of the CXs to move down a bit and then start all over again, since you've already moved down a bit, you're getting closer to the bottom. It's natural that that's going to be better than waiting for all the calculation to be completed. So the solution to this is rather strangely use randomness. And it's really not strange. If you think about it, this is something we do all the time in social life. You know, we have opinion polls all the time. Pollsters predict public mood. That is, which party is going to get more votes or whatever. They mess up quite a lot often, but that's a different story. But the way they do it, essentially, is they don't really go and ask every voter in the exit poll what you have voted for. They don't ask everybody. They ask a representative sample, a large enough representative sample. Of course, what they mess up in very often is that their sample that they end up taking may not be a representative sample. That's a different thing altogether. But the basic idea is if you take a representative sample, a randomized sample enough to be uniform, that no biases come in choosing them, you can make very good predictions about what the whole population is thinking. And the same idea goes here. In fact, it's actually better because here there are no cognitive biases. Instead of calculating the gradient by averaging over all the training inputs, what you do is take a random sample of M of them. This M is called a mini batch. That's a technical term. You take an M element mini batch instead of the N element training set. So maybe thousands of them at a time. And you take the gradient C is not calculated now because you can't calculate the gradient C unless you average over all the inputs. But what you do is you take a random number of them, average over those random numbers. So calculate the gradient for those random number of inputs. So small x's stood for the actual inputs, all of them. Capital X's are a subset, but they are only M in number. You are calculating the gradient for all those M and averaging over them. And that is what gives you an estimate for the actual gradient. Remember, the gradient of C is the real average of all of them, but if you take a big enough number and average them, then it's sort of going to give you a good enough indication. So this is how stochastic gradient descent works. So instead of del C del WK, what you have is del C xj, capital Xj del WK. You're summing up that over all the M and dividing by M. So stochastic gradient descent, again, how big is the mini batch going to be? That again is a hyperparameter. You have to choose it on your own. But again, if you know your data set well enough, you should be able to guess a reasonably good number. And of course, one possibility is if you find that your mini batch choice is giving you too many errors, then you can change in the validation set, then you can change directly. Now there's one more problem. Now this part, the last part. Okay, before I go any further, let me ask the audience, am I making any sense, or have I completely lost all of you?
No, sir, it's perfectly fine.
Well, that may be for you, that may not be fine for everybody, but anyway, I'm assuming that this part, at least, frankly, you don't have to follow the mathematics very deeply here. Or you don't have to understand everything of the mathematics. All this is available on the net and in the book I talked about. You can take a look at that in your leisure.
So, sir, if I understand correctly, if we have a multi-layer of hidden nodes, which means we'll have a more weights. So that means the hyperparameter will be more if in the case of multi-hidden layer.
I know those are not hyperparameters. Number of weights are part of the design. Hyperparameters are things which you fix once and for all for a particular design and don't change. Like the learning rate eta, like the mini batch size m. Okay, these are hyperparameters. Weights and biases are parameters. But you're right, they will be very large in number.
Okay.
Typically, they will be very large in number. That's what we are going to come to next. The next part is mathematically way more complicated than what we have been talking about here, and I may not go into the full details of all of this. I just want you to sort of get a feeling of what you do to solve this problem of huge numbers. So are there any questions about what I've said so far? And if somebody is commenting, I can't see you. So somebody will have to read it out. Or if there are no questions, I'm going to go forward.
Oh,
the next part is more mathematical.
One asking, is M prefixed? If so, how M is adjusted?
Again, that's exactly what I said. M is a hyperparameter which you choose by essentially using your, what do you call it? Your expertise, if you have it. This M, and one thing, of course, you can play around with it. After all, one good thing of doing this on a computer is that you may, if you choose a wrong value of M, you may have wasted half an hour. Then you adjust. This is strictly speaking in more proper production level systems. What is done is that you try to adjust your M values and eta values by looking at how well your output does on the validation set.
Is there any typical thumb of how?
Thumb rule is basically a few hundreds.
This reminds me of the protein folding problem we used to do in a research career.
So that's exactly the same kind of basic idea, right? Those are optimization problems.
Yes.
Protein folding is also optimization, and at least one way of calculating protein folding is by doing gradient descent.
Yes.
And
we used a little of it.
If you have a huge number of parameters, you don't do gradient descent, you do stochastic gradient descent. Which is
I have a question. You said that validation is for adjusting overshooting. I mean,
I'm actually oversimplifying. The validation is for other purposes as well.
I think it is also to avoid overfitting.
Overfitting, I've not come to that yet. But okay, I will talk about that in the end. I've not come to overfitting. And frankly, I'm not going to talk about all that really, because at an elementary level, that might get too complicated. But okay, since you have brought this up, let me also point out the very fact that we have so many weights and biases that actually has an opposite effect, in the sense that if you have way too many parameters which you can fit, you may end up fitting any known data. So it's very possible that that our parameters end up getting learned so well on the training data that they make no mistakes whatsoever. Okay. And then if I give them any other piece of new testing data, something else, they completely screw up. Which means that they have not really learned the rules. What they have done is overlearned the rules or overfitted the data. And that is a problem. Whenever you try to fit data with very many parameters, you may end up with a completely wrong fit. And for that, there are various other ways of handling that, where the validation set comes in very handy in handling those problems. And there are things like regularization, things like dropping off or killing off some neurons from time to time, so that some neurons don't end up dominating the entire thing. All this is technical and takes a lot of time to. Okay, if this were a semester-long course, this is what I would have talked about. These are things
Otish
I
asked
would have
a
talked about.
question.
Yeah.
Otish asked a question. I just read it out. Why is same parameter for W's and B's?
Why?
Same parameter for W's and
You
B's.
mean the learning rate?
I think he means what he wants to mean that why do you use the same eta for W? No, I mean
Yeah, but that you have to remember. You're doing gradient descent. You're going against the gradient. Gradient involves partial derivatives with respect to all the variables. So the components of the gradient are del C, del W, del C, del B. Actually, del C, del W1, del C, del W2, and all that, and del C, del B. Okay. Del C, del B1, del C, del B2. So this gradient is a vector in a large dimensional space, and because you want to come down as fast as possible, you're actually going against the gradient. Now, remember one thing about vectors. If you want to find a vector which is opposite a particular vector, you have to multiply the original vector by one negative number, which means every one of the components must be multiplied by the same negative number. So why is minus eta by m the same for every one of them? The answer is that unless you do that, you're not actually going against the gradient. If you multiply, say, different components of a vector by different numbers, then you're not going against that, not in the opposite direction. The whole idea is the cost function increases fastest when you go in the direction of the gradient and decreases fastest when you go opposite the direction of the gradient. And you want to go opposite.
Ananda,
That's why this is just a constant.
Ananda,
Why is it
how
not
to-
1? The answer is because I want to choose the learning rate to suit whether we are making big steps or small steps. And that's something which, again, unfortunately, these questions, why is it the same? That has a very specific, definite answer. If it's not the same, you're not doing gradient descent. You're not going against the gradient. On the other hand, how much this is, that can be only decided by looking at the problem and playing with it. You can, of course, change the parameters and see what happens. Okay, I will start part 2B now. I'm still in part 2.
Ananda,
Yeah.
can we give
What?
10 minutes break now?
No,
Depending
after
on how
2B.
much you
After 2B, because I will have to. 2B is 10-15 minutes. I'm not going to talk much about it.
Okay.
And then I'm going to give a 10 minutes break. Also, because I have to change my computer. My
Okay, good then.
actual computer, the one I'm comfortable
Where you
with.
will work on, yes.
Hopefully, that's still going to work. It's not been used, so it's going to work then.
And one more silly question. That is, why random sampling gives you better? Why not any bias or paper?
No, it doesn't give you better.
I mean,
Random sampling, of course, gives you better. Otherwise,
okay.
and if you by chance choose them, then you end up with a much bigger value for grad C than estimate for grad C than it is. Right?
Okay, right.
So you have to randomly sample okay, there's a whole bunch of statistical theory out there which says the best estimator for an estimator for the actual sample mean is if you take the unbiased mean over a small number. This is because there are no weighting. Okay, that's technical. I'm not going to go into the technical details now, but this is standard, right? You do it all the time. When you make 5 measurements, okay, now let's talk about the final technical part of this, and this part is a lot more technical than the previous part, and I'm very hesitant to unleash it in its full glory on you. So what I will do is tell you one thing. I will perhaps skip over many of the mathematical details in the next few slides, those mathematical details are sort of trivial. They only look complicated because there are so many W's, so many B's that there are a lot of indices. The thing looks complicated. If you want a good understanding about what is going on, it's a very nice place to start. Let's come back to the basic. But the idea is so beautiful and so innocent, simple that I can't resist at least sharing the idea with you.